His wife stood up in front of both families, raised a glass, and told everyone she needed space to become the woman she was meant to be. And he said okay, not because he was weak, not because he had no options, but because a quiet man who already knows what cards he's holding doesn't need to flip the table. He just needs to wait for the right moment to lay them down. What his wife didn't know, what her father had spent 7 years praying she would never find out, was that the man she dismissed in front of a yard full of people had inherited something that made her family's entire empire fragile. A 1987 document, a mother's handwriting, a 22% stake buried inside the collateral of a $22 million development deal that her father needed to survive, and the woman her wife trusted with every secret she ever kept from him. She'd already seen the paperwork, she'd already made the call, and she'd already decided which side of history she wanted to stand on. So when his wife asked for space back, he gave her every inch of it. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, you're going to want to stay for every second of this one. Hit that like button before we go any further, and if you're new here, subscribe, because this channel is where the patient ones always win. And drop your city in the comments right now. Where are you watching from today? Let's see the map light up. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started. A 4th of July cookout, a yard full of people, and a man standing at the edge of someone else's world, holding a photograph that nobody at that party realized was about to change everything. The Whitfield estate sat on 2 acres in Cascade Heights, and on the 4th of July it looked exactly like what Gerald Whitfield needed everyone to believe it was. String lights ran the length of the back fence. A catering crew in black aprons moved between tables draped in white linen. Somebody had set up a speaker stack near the gazebo, and Al Green drifted across the yard like smoke, easy and warm, mixing with the smell of ribs and charcoal and somebody's good perfume. Children ran through sprinklers near the garden edge. The driveway held 4 luxury cars and a rented party tent. Solomon Price stood near the drink station holding a plate he hadn't touched. He was not uncomfortable in the way an outsider is uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable the way a man gets when he has been somewhere long enough to know exactly what it costs him to stay. He wore a clean blue linen shirt and dark slacks. He had pressed them himself that morning. He watched the yard the way he watched his students, with patient attention, cataloguing things, filing them away. Renee was across the grass with her mother, Evelyn, and 2 of Evelyn's church friends. She was laughing at something, her hand on Evelyn's arm, her head tilted at the angle she used when she wanted to look unbothered and magnetic at the same time. Solomon knew that angle well. He had once found it beautiful. He heard his name. Not spoken to him, spoken about him. Renee's voice carried more than she realized when she was comfortable, and she was always comfortable in this yard. He caught the tail end of it. Something about the novel, something about the 3rd rejection letter, and then Evelyn's low, satisfied sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but contained all the meaning of both. Solomon set his fork down on the edge of his plate. He did not look over. He picked the fork back up. Gerald held court near the far end of the yard with 3 men Solomon recognized as business partners, and 1 he didn't. Gerald was built like a man who had once been athletic and had since replaced that with authority. He wore a cream linen blazer and laughed loudly and often. Earlier in the afternoon he had walked past Solomon with a hand briefly on his shoulder, warm, transactional, the greeting you give a valet, and resumed his conversation without breaking stride. Solomon had watched him go. He had noted it the way he noted everything, filed it, moved on. The afternoon stretched. The children got louder. The Al Green gave way to something with more bass. Solomon refilled his cup and found a spot near one of the linen tables where he could stand without being in anyone's way. On the table beside him sat a small cluster of framed family photos. The Whitfields at various graduations, at a ribbon cutting, at what looked like a resort somewhere warm, and at the edge of the cluster, almost behind a vase of sunflowers, a smaller frame, an older photograph, slightly faded, a woman Solomon recognized, his mother, Dorothy Price. Younger than he had ever known her in his own memory, but unmistakably her. Standing beside a man he did not recognize, both of them dressed like it was a formal occasion, both of them smiling. He picked the frame up without thinking. He was still looking at it when Renee called for everyone's attention. The yard quieted in stages. The music was turned down. Children were gathered. Gerald moved to the edge of the group with his glass already raised, like he had been expecting this, like it had been discussed. Renee stood in the center of the yard. She was poised. She had always been poised. She looked around at the assembled faces of her family and her parents' friends and the neighbors who had been invited, and she smiled the way a person smiles when they have rehearsed something and are finally delivering it. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said that life was short and clarity was rare, and that she owed it to herself to pursue both. She said she loved Solomon and always would, but that she needed space. Room, she said, room to become the woman she was meant to be. Evelyn raised her glass. Someone on the left side of the yard started to clap and stopped when no one joined. Solomon stood with his mother's photograph in his hand, and 30 people arranged around him like a sentence that had just ended. He set down his plate. He set it down carefully on the white linen without making a sound. He said, "Okay." One word, level. Not wounded, not furious, not performed. Just a word, clean and complete. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair beside him. He still had the photograph in his hand. He tucked it gently under his arm, and as he turned toward the side gate, he glanced once, not intentionally, not dramatically, in Gerald Whitfield's direction. Gerald was looking at the photograph. For less than 2 seconds, something moved across Gerald's face. His jaw tightened. His eyes dropped. Then the businessman came back. The easy smile, the relaxed shoulders, and he turned to say something to the man beside him. Solomon noticed. He didn't know yet what he had noticed, but he noticed. He walked through the gate, got in his car, and drove home alone through a July evening that smelled like charcoal and honeysuckle and fireworks that hadn't gone off yet. The house was dark when he got there. He sat in the kitchen without turning on the lights, his mother's photograph on the table in front of him, and for a long time he simply held the quiet around him like something he was learning the shape of. He didn't understand what Gerald had seen. Not yet. But he had filed it. And Solomon Price had never once lost a thing he filed away. To understand what happened that 4th of July, you have to understand the 7 years that came before it. Solomon Price was not a man who needed much. He had his classroom, his students, his manuscript, and a modest house in East Atlanta that he kept clean and quiet and full of books. He taught 11th grade history at Carver High School with the kind of dedication that made parents request him by name and made administrators take note. He coached the junior debate team on Tuesday afternoons without extra pay. He graded papers at the kitchen table after dinner, red pen in hand, gospel radio low in the background, a cup of tea going cold beside him. He was building something with his life. It was just a slower build than the Whitfields considered respectable. He met Renee in 2016 at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Buckhead. She was bright and sharp and laughed at things that were actually funny, which Solomon had always considered underrated. She came from money, but didn't seem imprisoned by it, or so he thought. They dated for 14 months. He proposed on a Sunday morning in his kitchen, no restaurant, no audience, just the two of them, and a ring he had saved for across 3 semesters. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Her family said considerably less flattering things. Gerald Whitfield made his position clear at the first dinner after the engagement. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He simply looked at Solomon across the table with the measured assessment of a man who had spent 40 years reading property values at a glance, and he said, "Solomon seems like a good man with no ceiling." He said it the way a contractor talks about a house with foundation problems, warm enough on the surface, devastating underneath. Evelyn said nothing. She smiled her principal's smile and passed the sweet potatoes and asked Renee about the venue. Renee defended Solomon that night in the car ride home. She defended him at Christmas that year when Gerald made another comment about teachers' pensions. She defended him in year 2 when Evelyn quietly suggested that Solomon might consider getting his real estate license, something more scalable, but defending someone against your own family is exhausting work. And somewhere in year 3, Renee put the shield down. She didn't announce it, she just stopped picking it up. The erosion was gradual and it arrived in increments small enough to argue with individually, but devastating in some. The manuscript was the first real wound. Solomon had been working on his novel for 4 years, a historical fiction set during the Great Migration, meticulous and serious and deeply personal. In the spring of 2021, it was rejected by the 3rd literary agent in a row. He came home to tell Renee and found her already on the phone with Evelyn, voiced low, the words, "I told you it was a long shot," moving through the wall of the bedroom like smoke under a door. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen and made dinner and did not say anything about what he had heard. The vacation was the second wound. The Whitfields had a standing annual trip, a week in Hilton Head, the same rental house for 12 years, the same gathering of family and long-time friends. In the summer of 2022, Solomon was told, gently and with great reasonableness, that it was really more of a family thing, that he would probably be bored, that he should use the time to work on the book. He nodded. He took the week off from school anyway and painted the back porch and finished reading a stack of library books and told himself it did not mean what it meant. It meant exactly what it meant. The third wound was the one he was not supposed to hear. It was a Tuesday evening in March of 2023. Renee was on the back porch with a glass of wine, voice carrying through the screen door into the kitchen where Solomon was washing dishes. Camille was on the other end of the call. He caught it in pieces. The pauses, the careful phrasing, the thing Renee said when she thought the water was still running. "I love him, Camille. I do. I just didn't think it would still feel like this at 34. He turned the faucet off. He stood at the sink with wet hands and listened to the silence that followed. What he did not hear, because Camille said it quietly, was Camille's response. But he saw the next morning at breakfast that Renee was slightly colder than usual, the way she got after a conversation that hadn't gone the way she wanted. Camille had not agreed with her. He filed that too. He filed everything. By 2024, Renee had stopped introducing him as her husband at work events. It was subtle enough that no one called it out. She said, "my partner," with the brisk efficiency of someone updating a record, and moved on. Solomon heard about it from a colleague of hers who didn't realize it would land the way it did. He said nothing. He never said nothing because he had nothing to say. He said nothing because he was the kind of man who understood that silence, deployed correctly, is its own form of preparation. The Whitfield family had built an empire on the appearance of permanence. From the outside, every column was straight, every surface polished, every account in order. But Camille Brooks had spent 10 years as a forensic accountant, and she knew better than most that the most impressive facades are often the ones with the most to hide. She had started looking, and what she found was about to change everything. Camille Brooks had built her entire professional life on the principle that numbers did not lie, people lied, documents got backdated, signatures got forged, but the numbers themselves, the trail of figures moving between accounts, the timestamps on wire transfers, the line items buried in footnotes on page 40 of an annual filing, those told the truth every single time, if you knew how to read them. And Camille knew how to read them better than almost anyone in Atlanta. She had her own practice, Brooks Forensic Accounting, operating out of a clean two-room office in her Kirkwood home. Her desk faced the window. She kept a second monitor for spreadsheets and a printed calendar on the wall because she did not trust herself to check a digital one when she was deep in a file. She had built her reputation quietly, the way serious people build serious things. One careful engagement at a time, mostly referrals, never advertising. She was 35 years old and she had testified in 4 federal cases and never once been rattled on cross-examination. She was not a person who rattled easily. The Whitfield Development Group file came to her in March, 6 weeks before the 4th of July cookout. A separate client, a commercial contractor in Buckhead, had flagged a discrepancy in a joint venture agreement that referenced Whitfield's original company structure. The contractor needed Camille to trace the equity lineage going back to the founding entity. Standard work, 2 days, maybe 3. She pulled the original incorporation documents from the Georgia Secretary of State Records. She pulled the 1987 Articles of Organization for Whitfield Property Associates, the predecessor company. And on page 7 of the original shareholder agreement, in the clean block type of a notary-certified document, she found a name, Dorothy M. Price. Camille sat back in her chair. The agreement listed Dorothy M. Price as a silent investor. $340,000 contributed in full on August 14, 1987. 22% equity stake in Whitfield Property Associates, the entity that had since been restructured, renamed, and grown into Whitfield Development Group, currently valued at $18 million on its most recent disclosure. Camille stared at the name for a long time. Then she opened a second tab and typed, Dorothy Price, Atlanta, Georgia. An obituary came up, past 2021, survived by one son, Solomon Price of Atlanta. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet of her office for 4 days before she called him. She turned it over every way she could think to turn it. She considered that she might be wrong about the connection. She considered that even if she was right, it was not her information to carry. She considered what it would mean for her friendship with Renee, which was 15 years old and had survived arguments and distance and the kinds of small betrayals that accumulate between women who stay close long enough. She considered all of it, carefully and honestly, and then on the 5th day she picked up the phone. She chose a coffee shop on Moreland Avenue, neutral ground, nothing near either of their neighborhoods. She got there early and took a corner table and ordered a water and waited. Solomon arrived in the clothes he wore on the days he graded papers, a plain grey shirt, dark jeans, reading glasses pushed up on his head. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who had other things on his mind. He sat down across from her and said hello, and she said hello, and for a moment they just looked at each other the way two people look at each other when they both know something has shifted. She put a printed copy of the shareholder agreement on the table between them. She had highlighted Dorothy's name and the dollar amount and the equity percentage in yellow. She did not editorialize. She walked him through it the way she walked clients through findings, methodical, precise, one fact at a time. Solomon picked up the document. He read the highlighted sections. He set it down. Then he did something she had not expected. He pressed both hands flat on the table, very slowly, like he needed to feel something solid. His eyes went somewhere that was not the coffee shop. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just been handed a piece of information that required him to reorganize everything he thought he knew about his own life. He looked, for a long and unguarded moment, like a man who missed his mother with a specific and sudden ferocity. The silence held for nearly a full minute. Camille let it. She was not a person who filled silences that needed to be felt. When he finally looked up, she told him the second thing. She told him she had spent 7 years at those dinners and those cookouts and those holiday tables watching him absorb things that no one should have to absorb. She told him she had changed the subject and looked away and told herself it was not her place, and she was done telling herself that. She said it without drama. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, with her eyes on his. Solomon looked at her for a moment. Then he looked out the window at Moreland Avenue, at the afternoon traffic moving past, and he was quiet again for a long time. He did not respond to the second thing. Not then. But he folded the document carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He took a photograph of it on his phone before he left. And when he walked to his car, Camille watched through the window and saw that the way he was carrying himself had changed just slightly, like a man who had remembered something important about himself and was still deciding what to do with it. The shoebox had been on the top shelf of his home office closet for 3 years. He had sorted around it, sorted near it, sorted everything but its contents. He had told himself there was no hurry. He had told himself there would be time. Now he understood why that shelf had always felt like it was waiting for him. He went up to get the shoebox the morning after he got home from the cookout. He had not slept much. He had sat in the kitchen until the July dark gave way to a grey and humid dawn, his mother's photograph on the table, Gerald Whitfield's 2-second reaction playing on a quiet loop somewhere behind his eyes. He had made coffee he barely touched. He had watched the light change in the window above the sink. And then, just after 7 in the morning, he had walked down the hall to his home office and climbed onto the chair and reached for the shelf. The shoebox was exactly where it had always been. He brought it to the desk and sat down and lifted the lid. The contents were what he remembered. A stack of his mother's letters rubber-banded together, some loose receipts, a folded church program from her home-going service that he had placed there without meaning to make it permanent, a few photographs, a small spiral notebook filled with her handwriting. He had sorted through most of it in the weeks after she passed, most of it, but not all. At the bottom of the box, beneath the notebook, was a sealed envelope. He had seen it before. He had picked it up before. Both times he had set it back down, telling himself he would get to it when he was ready, knowing somewhere underneath that ready was not the real issue. The real issue was that his mother's handwriting on the front of that envelope, Solomon, when the time comes, had felt like a sentence he was not prepared to finish. He was ready now. He opened it carefully, the way she had taught him to open things that mattered. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a share certificate, cream-coloured, formally printed, bearing the name Whitfield Property Associates, and dated August 14, 1987. The second was a notarized shareholder agreement, 6 pages, clipped together, with his mother's signature on the final page beside a notary seal. The third was a single handwritten page, folded in half, his name on the outside in the same deliberate cursive she used when she wanted something to last. He read the note last. Dorothy Price had written it in the year before she died. She explained the investment plainly. $340,000, money she had saved and inherited and set aside across the better part of 2 decades, placed quietly into a new development company whose founder she had known through a mutual business acquaintance. She had believed in the opportunity. She had also believed, she wrote, that a woman who loved her son the way she loved hers did not leave him a ceiling. She left him a foundation. She wrote that she had chosen not to tell him while she was alive because she wanted him to build his own confidence on his own terms, without the cushion making him soft. She wrote that if he was reading the letter, it meant the time had come, and she trusted him to know what to do with it. She ended with 4 words, "You were always enough." Solomon sat with the letter in both hands for a long time. He was not a man who cried easily or often. But the particular grief of being seen by someone who was no longer there to see you, that was its own specific weight, and it settled on him fully in that room, in the morning quiet, with the gospel station playing low from the kitchen radio down the hall. He gave himself the time it required. Then he picked up his phone and called Patricia Okafor. He had used Patricia once before, 3 years earlier, for a straightforward estate matter after Dorothy passed. She was a senior partner at Okafor and Webb Legal Group, a woman who occupied her office the way a judge occupies a courtroom, with the absolute calm of someone who had already considered every possible outcome and found none of them surprising. She answered on the second ring. He told her he had documents he needed her to look at. She asked when he could come in. He said today, if possible. She said 2 o'clock. Her office was on Peachtree Street, 14th floor, with a view of Midtown Atlanta that Gerald Whitfield would have approved of under different circumstances. Patricia spread the documents across her conference table and read them with the focused silence of a person who charged for the minutes she spent thinking. She asked 3 clarifying questions. She made 2 phone calls that Solomon was not privy to, stepping briefly into the adjacent room. When she came back, she sat down and folded her hands. She explained the inheritance chain first. Clean, uncontested, Dorothy's estate had passed directly to Solomon with no competing claims. She explained the current valuation of Whitfield Development Group. She explained what 22% of $18 million represented at fair market value, $3.96 million. Then she explained the part that changed everything else. Whitfield Commons, the family's current flagship project, a $22 million mixed-use development currently under construction in southwest Atlanta, had been financed through a construction loan from First Capital Southern. That loan had been collateralized using the full equity structure of the original company. Solomon's dormant stake was embedded in that collateral package like a splinter in a foundation wall. The moment he formally asserted his ownership, the loan covenant would trip into technical breach. First, Capital Southern would have the right to issue a cure notice and, if unresolved within 30 days, accelerate the full $9 million outstanding balance. Patricia let that land. Then she asked him one question. "What do you want to do?" Solomon looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. He thought about the cookout. He thought about the vacation he hadn't been invited on. He thought about the hallway and the manuscript and 7 years of filing things away. He thought about his mother's handwriting. "You were always enough. I want everything my mother intended me to have." Patricia Okafor opened a new client file, and she began making calls. Patricia Okafor did not believe in warnings. She had explained this to Solomon at their second meeting, sitting across from him with her hands folded and her reading glasses pushed to the top of her head, and she had said it the way she said most things, quietly, without decoration, as a statement of professional philosophy that was not up for debate. Warnings, she told him, were gifts you gave to people who had not earned them. Gerald Whitfield had spent 37 years sitting on a document that belonged to Solomon's family. He did not get a courtesy call. The strategy was precise and sequenced. Patricia walked Solomon through it step by step, using the kind of clean, declarative language that left no room for misunderstanding. First, the formal equity assertion, a legal filing establishing Solomon as the rightful heir to Dorothy's 22% stake in Whitfield Development Group. No advance notice, no negotiation overture, just the filing, clean and official, and entered into the public record. Once filed, the clock started. First, Capital Southern's loan covenant monitoring systems would flag the ownership dispute within 11 days. After that, the bank had its own obligations, a cure notice to Whitfield Development Group, 30 days to resolve or face acceleration of the $9 million balance. The second element was timing. Renee had retained a divorce attorney in August, and her proceedings were moving along a standard track. Patricia explained that once Solomon's equity was formally asserted and the asset picture changed, Renee's lifestyle affidavit, which had been prepared without any knowledge of the dispute, would be in direct conflict with the live legal matter. Her attorney would have no choice but to request a continuance. The divorce proceedings would stall. The Whitfield family's private business would become a matter of active public record at the precise moment Renee was trying to finalize her freedom from Solomon. The irony of it was surgical. Solomon had one preparatory move to make on his own. He drove to the county probate office on a Tuesday morning and filed an updated estate beneficiary designation, formally placing himself as the sole heir to Dorothy Price's holdings, a step that had been technically pending since her death, never completed because he had never fully sorted the shoebox. He did it quietly, without fanfare, the way his mother had made her original investment. Just a man in a county office signing a form that would change everything, and no one in the building had any idea. Patricia filed the equity assertion on a Wednesday. Solomon taught his third period class on the American Civil Rights Movement that same afternoon, standing at the whiteboard with a dry erase marker, asking his students about the specific patience required to execute a long strategy. He was not thinking about Gerald Whitfield. He was thinking about his students. That was the thing about Solomon Price. He was always fully present where he was, which was part of why the people who underestimated him had always gotten it so wrong. The Sunday before the filing hit the public record, he drove to a farmer's market in Decatur with Camille. It was the third time they had spent a Sunday afternoon together since the coffee shop meeting, and by now the ease between them had settled into something unhurried and real. She carried a canvas tote. He bought peaches and a jar of local honey, and argued pleasantly with a vendor about the best cornbread preparation, a conversation Camille watched with a quiet smile that she didn't try to hide. They sat on a bench near the end of the market row, and she pulled the printed pages of his first chapter out of her bag. She had asked to read it the week before, and he had given it to her without the apprehension he usually felt handing his work to anyone connected to his marriage. She had underlined 3 sentences. She showed him which ones without explaining why, and he read them and nodded, and something in his chest settled that had not been settled in a long time. Gerald Whitfield called on a Thursday evening. Solomon was at his kitchen table grading papers when the phone buzzed. He looked at the name. He set the phone face down on the table and let it ring through to voicemail. When it was done, he picked it up and listened once. Then he listened again. Gerald's voice on the voicemail was controlled but thin at the edges, like a man who had spent the day deciding how to sound calm and had mostly succeeded. He said he thought it would be wise for the two of them to have a private conversation. He said he wanted to be fair to Solomon, wanted to make sure Solomon was taken care of. He mentioned the number $800,000 like he was doing Solomon a favor. He said he hoped they could handle this quietly, between family. Solomon forwarded the voicemail to Patricia without adding a single word of his own. Her written response went out the following morning on Okafor and web letterhead, addressed to Gerald's attorney of record. It contained no pleasantries, no preamble, and no ambiguity. Fair market value was $3.96 million. Anything less would be resolved through litigation. The letter was 4 sentences long. First, Capital Southern flagged the covenant breach 11 days after the filing, exactly as Patricia had projected. The cure notice went out to Whitfield Development Group on a Monday morning. It landed on Gerald's desk at 9:47. He read it twice. He did not call his wife. He did not call Renee. He did not call his attorney, not right away. He sat alone in his office with the notice in his hand and looked out his window at the Atlanta skyline, and for the first time in a long time, Gerald Whitfield sat with a silence he could not control. He held it for 4 days. He told himself he was building a story. He was really just watching the walls close in. The Atlanta Business Chronicle ran the brief on a Friday afternoon. 400 words, courthouse records, a clerk with a habit. The headline read, "Local teacher asserts multi-million-dollar stake in Whitfield Development Group." By Friday evening it had been screenshotted. By Saturday morning it was in 2 group chats. By Sunday, before the first church service let out in the Whitfields' neighborhood, it was in a 3rd. This one connected directly to the congregation where Evelyn Whitfield had sat in the same pew for 19 years. Evelyn did not attend Tuesday prayer group that week. She did not attend the following week either. she sent a brief message to the group leader about a family matter requiring her attention. The group leader responded with a prayer emoji. The damage was already done. That particular silence said more than her presence ever had. Gerald's construction partner, a man named Clifton Reeves, who had co-signed the Whitfield Commons development agreement, called Gerald on Monday. The call lasted 22 minutes. Clifton invoked the co-approval clause on Tuesday. Under that clause, no further project draws could be processed until the ownership dispute was resolved. Whitfield Commons, every concrete pour, every subcontractor invoice, every piece of the $22 million project, froze. The subcontractors were notified on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 of them had called their own attorneys. Gerald called Solomon that same afternoon, bypassing Patricia entirely. His voice came through the phone like a man who had started the call, planning to be threatening, and realized halfway through the dial that he no longer had the leverage for it. He said Solomon was making a mistake. He said there were people who would be hurt by this. He said he had always respected Solomon, always, and he just needed Solomon to understand the bigger picture here. Solomon listened to all of it. Then he said 4 words. "Contact my attorney, Gerald." He ended the call. He sat at his kitchen table for a moment. Then he went back to grading papers. Renee's attorney filed for a continuance on Thursday. The lifestyle affidavit she had submitted, itemizing the Whitfield family assets as context for her divorce settlement, assets her attorney had presented as stable and uncontested, now sat directly inside an active legal dispute. Her attorney had no choice. The motion for continuance went into the record. Renee found out when her attorney called her at 11:45 in the morning. She called Gerald immediately. That conversation did not go well. Gerald, stretched thin across 4 simultaneous crises, told Renee things he had not intended to tell her about the equity stake, about Dorothy Price, about the 7 years of silence he had maintained since the day Solomon Price had walked into his family's life, holding a photograph of a woman Gerald recognized from a 1987 closing document. Renee went very quiet on the phone, the kind of quiet that arrives when the story you have been telling yourself about your own life reveals an entirely different foundation underneath. She stopped calling Camille that same week. Camille had not returned a call in 9 days. No explanation, no fight, no final conversation, just the silence of a woman who had made her choice and was living inside it without apology. Renee had left 3 voicemails. The third one was shorter than the first 2, and her voice in it was different, less indignant, more uncertain. On Wednesday evening, Renee drove to Camille's apartment in Kirkwood. Solomon's car was parked at the curb. She pulled in across the street and turned off her engine. The lights were on in Camille's front windows. She could not see inside. She sat in her car with both hands in her lap and looked at the building for 11 minutes by the clock on her dashboard. Then she started the car and drove away. She did not call Camille again. The second Atlanta Business Chronicle brief published the following Friday. 15 column inches this time, not 400 words, an actual feature, triggered by the subcontractor filings and the project freeze on Whitfield Commons. It named the development, named the dispute, named the dollar figures. It quoted a commercial real estate analyst who called the situation a significant disruption to one of Southwest Atlanta's most anticipated mixed-use projects. It did not quote Solomon. It did not need to. Gerald sent a message to Patricia Okafor on Saturday demanding a face-to-face meeting. Patricia forwarded it to Solomon with a single line. "Your call." Solomon read the message. He thought about Gerald at the cookout. The cream blazer, the easy laugh, the hand on Solomon's shoulder like a valet's tip. He thought about 37 years of strategic silence. He thought about a note in a shoebox, written in his mother's handwriting. He told Patricia yes. But the meeting would be in her conference room, on a date Solomon chose, With the session formally recorded, Gerald agreed to every condition. He had no leverage left to refuse with. Renee called Solomon the night before the meeting. He answered on the third ring. She talked for a while, disjointed, emotional, reaching for something she couldn't quite name. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he spoke quietly and without cruelty. "I'll have Patricia reach out to your attorney." He said good night. He hung up. Renee sat with the phone in her hand and understood, for the first time, that she was no longer dealing with the man she had dismissed at a 4th of July cookout. That man had said okay and walked to his car. This man had Patricia Okafor on retainer and a conference room reserved for 9 o'clock the following morning. She had wanted someone she could manage. What she had was someone she had to negotiate with. Patricia Okafor's conference room on the 14th floor had no art on the walls, just clean paint, a long mahogany table, 8 chairs, and a window that looked out over Peachtree Street with the indifferent clarity of a room that had seen every kind of human reckoning and treated them all the same. A digital recorder sat at the center of the table, already running when Gerald and Renee arrived at 9:52. Gerald came in the way he always came into rooms. First, purposeful, filling the doorway with the practiced ease of a man who had built his identity on entrances. He wore a charcoal suit and a burgundy tie, and carried a leather portfolio that he set on the table in front of him, like a weapon being laid down with deliberate visibility. Renee walked in beside him, a half-step behind. She looked like a woman who had not slept well in 2 weeks. The composure was still there, applied carefully over the surface, but it was the composure of effort rather than ease. She sat down without looking at the recorder. They waited. Solomon arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. He wore a white dress shirt, dark slacks, and shoes he had polished himself that morning. He carried nothing. He did not bring a portfolio or a folder or a single piece of paper. He walked in behind Patricia, sat down across from Gerald, and folded his hands on the table with the quiet of a man who had already decided how this day would end. Patricia sat at the head of the table. She poured herself a glass of water and said nothing. Gerald opened. He called the situation unfortunate. He said he understood that Solomon was hurting and that the end of a marriage was always painful. He said he wanted to be reasonable, wanted to be fair, and he slid a single document across the table with the smooth confidence of someone offering a gift rather than a settlement. $1.2 million structured across 4 years, a full and final resolution of all claims. Patricia looked at the document. She did not touch it. She turned to Solomon and gave one small nod. Solomon looked at Gerald for a long moment. Then he began to speak. He said he wanted to talk about a dinner. The first Thanksgiving after the wedding, when Gerald had told a room full of people a story about a building he was developing and then, mid-sentence, turned away from Solomon to address someone else, as if Solomon were furniture that had briefly appeared in his eye line. Solomon said he had noted it at the time and said nothing. He said he wanted to talk about the Christmas when Evelyn had suggested he look into real estate licensing, framing it as encouragement, while meaning it as an instruction to become someone more useful. He said he had noted that too. Gerald shifted in his chair. Solomon said he wanted to talk about the phrase, no ceiling. He said Gerald had used it in the first year of the marriage, and Solomon had heard it clearly, every syllable of it, and had understood exactly what it meant in the mouth of a man like Gerald Whitfield. He said that what Gerald had not known, what he had been so certain he would never have to account for, was that the ceiling Gerald had assigned to Solomon did not exist. It had never existed. Dorothy Price had made sure of that in 1987, 37 years before this room, with $340,000 and a notarized document and the kind of quiet, strategic love that did not announce itself. Gerald opened his mouth. Patricia raised one hand, flat, and he closed it. Solomon said he wanted to talk about what Gerald had known and when he had known it. He walked through it calmly. The closing document, Dorothy's name, the equity stake that had been sitting dormant in a shoebox while Gerald built Whitfield Development Group into an $18 million company and structured a $22 million development loan around a collateral package that contained a time bomb he had been praying for 7 years would never detonate. He said Gerald had looked at Solomon on the day of the wedding and made a calculation. He said that calculation had been wrong. Gerald's second attempt to speak came with more force. Patricia's hand went up again, and this time her eyes went with it. Gerald went still. Solomon turned to Renee. He said her name once, quietly, the way you say the name of someone you once loved and are now releasing from the obligation of pretending. He said he remembered the hallway. He said he remembered standing at the kitchen sink with wet hands while her voice came through the screen door. And he remembered every word she had said to Camille. And he had never once, not in a single moment, made her feel what that had made him feel. He said he remembered the manuscript and the phone call to Evelyn before he had been told. He remembered Hilton Head and the way she had said it was a family thing, and the careful reasonableness of it, as if careful reasonableness made the exclusion something other than what it was. He said, "You wanted space, Renee. I gave you every inch of it. But what you didn't know was that the ground your family built their whole life on had my mother's name written on it. And the woman you trusted with every secret you kept from me figured that out before you did." The room was absolutely silent. Renee's composure broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. It simply gave way the way a wall gives way when the foundation beneath it finally shifts. Her face changed, her shoulders came forward. The sound she made was small and genuine and had nothing performed about it. Gerald's posture failed in the same moment, differently. The businessman didn't crumble so much as deflate, the portfolio and the charcoal suit suddenly looking like a costume on a man who had forgotten what he was wearing. He looked, for the first time in Solomon's memory, like someone who had run out of moves. Solomon stood. He buttoned the single button of his jacket. He looked at Patricia. "We're done here." He walked to the door without hurrying. He did not look back. The door closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Gerald was still seated at the table, the unsigned settlement document in front of him. Renee had both hands over her face. Patricia reached over and stopped the recorder. She had a follow-up filing already drafted in her bag, and the Atlanta Business Chronicle had a call scheduled with her for 2 o'clock that afternoon. She gathered her papers without urgency, the way a person gathers things when the outcome has never been in doubt. 6 months after Solomon Price walked out of Patricia Okafor's conference room, the settlement was finalized. $3.96 million. Clean transfer. No structured payments, no conditions, no goodwill gestures dressed up as generosity. The full fair market value of Dorothy Price's 22% stake paid in a single transaction into an account Solomon had opened the week after the cookout in a bank 2 neighborhoods over from anywhere the Whitfields had ever set foot. Gerald Whitfield signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning. His attorney signed beside him. There were no photographs of the occasion. First Capital Southern, satisfied that the ownership dispute was resolved, lifted the covenant breach notice and allowed the Whitfield Commons loan to proceed. But the lender had conditions of their own. As part of the restructured loan agreement, an independent management firm was brought in to oversee the project's completion. Gerald retained his equity position, but operational control of Whitfield Commons passed to outside hands. His name was removed from the development signage at the lender's insistence, replaced with the name of the management firm in clean sans serif lettering that Gerald drove past once and did not drive past again. The estate went on the market in October. Evelyn had already gone by then. She packed carefully and quietly over the course of 2 weeks and drove to her sister's home in Birmingham without announcing a departure date to anyone in her social circle. The house sold in 31 days. The new owners repainted the front door a colour Evelyn would not have approved of. Renee's divorce settlement was finalised the same week as the equity transfer, with the Whitfield family assets now accurately reflected in the public record, adjusted downward, restructured, and no longer the uncontested foundation her attorney had presented them as. The settlement reflected the corrected picture. She received her fair share of the marital assets, nothing more, nothing. Her attorney filed the final paperwork without comment. Renee did not call Solomon after that. He did not expect her to. Solomon used the settlement money the way his mother had always used money, with intention, without performance. He established the Dorothy Price Foundation in November, named after the woman who had understood 37 years ago that the most powerful thing you can give someone is a foundation they don't know they're standing on until the moment they need it most. The foundation's mandate was simple: annual scholarships for first-generation college students in Atlanta, with preference given to students from the southwest side of the city, the same neighborhoods where Whitfield Commons was finally being built. The first cohort was 8 students. Solomon announced them at a small ceremony at Carver High School, in the same building where he still taught 11th grade history on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He kept teaching. People asked him why, after the settlement, he didn't leave. He found the question genuinely confusing. He was a good teacher. His students needed him. The work was the work, regardless of what was in his bank account. That had always been true, and the number had not changed it. His novel was accepted for publication in December. A small independent press in Atlanta, honest people, modest advance, a real editorial relationship with an editor who had actually read the manuscript and underlined things and called Solomon with questions that proved she understood what he was trying to do. The book was set for publication the following fall. Solomon read the acceptance letter twice at his kitchen table and then made himself a cup of tea and sat with it quietly for a while. There was one other thing worth telling. On a Sunday morning in January, 6 months after the cookout and 2 months after the settlement, Solomon sat at his kitchen table with a second mug across from him and the final page proofs of his dedication spread between 2 people. Camille was in the chair across from him, her feet tucked under her, reading the dedication page with the same focused attention she brought to everything. She had a pencil behind her ear that she wasn't going to use. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the particular winter light that comes through east-facing windows on clear Atlanta mornings, low and clean and honest. She looked up from the page. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "She would have liked this." Solomon looked at the dedication. Dorothy M. Price, 1951 to 2021. You were always enough. He said, yeah, she would have. That was all. No announcement, no performance, no drama. Just 2 people who had been in the same orbit for 7 years, finally inhabiting the same quiet on a Sunday morning, with coffee getting warm and a book about to go into the world. And now you know the full story of Solomon Price, a man who was told he had no ceiling by people who had been unknowingly living under a roof his mother helped build. He never raised his voice. He never made a scene. He absorbed every wound, filed every insult, and waited with the patience of a man who already knew, somewhere beneath the surface, that the truth was in the shoebox. The lesson here is not about revenge, it is about inheritance. What we leave behind, what we carry forward, and what happens when the people who underestimated you finally run out of places to stand. Dorothy Price left her son a foundation, and when the time came, he used it exactly the way she intended. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Solomon's position? Would you have waited, or would you have moved sooner? Drop your answer in the comments, because this community always has something real to say, and I read every single one. If this story hit the way it was supposed to hit, do me a favor and tap that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you are new here, welcome. This is the place where patience wins and the truth always finds its way to the surface. Subscribe and stay close, because I will see you in the next one.